2 of 2 Samuel. Actually, no, chapter 3. The background's chapters 2 through 4. And last week we talked about David, right after Saul's death, how he was trying to make the transition into his kingship a smooth process. But this week we're going to find out that process didn't quite go as easily as what he hoped. But actually, by the end of the lesson, we're going to find out that God worked it out for the benefit of the kingdom, so that there wasn't a divided kingdom, but there was a united kingdom. And we're going to see the process in all this. There was some things going on behind the scenes, under the surface, that we as Americans may not understand, but as Christians, we need to understand the context of what was going on so we can understand what God did in the midst of that to bring about David's being brought forth as king throughout the whole nation. Because right now, David was crowned king by Judah. Now, the other part of Israel was still not on his side yet. There was still division, and actually, there's going to be a civil war that's going to ensue unless something happens within the context of the passages today. And so we're going to look at that and see how God diverted that through the issues that arose in Israel. There was animosity among the Jews. You see, Saul was king, and his family line would be the next in line to be king naturally. But God had already told David and anointed David as king over Israel. And see, Saul knew that. Saul's family knew that. And Saul's military leader, Abner, knew that. But yet, he tried to usurp that. As we look at the lesson today, we're going to see that. There was a lot going on. You see, you have Abner and Joab. Abner was the military leader for Saul. Joab was the military leader for David. And what you're going to find out is their mindset is to be in control. And there's some things that happen. We're not going to read about what Joab did to Abner later, but I'm going to discuss it at the end of the lesson because it plays into this whole smooth transition that needs to take place. Now, let's look at verse 8 in chapter 3 in 2 Samuel. If you got your Bible, if not, it's in our lesson books. My pages are different, so what's your page that your verses are in? 21. So if you got your books open to 21, you can read along. It says, Abner was very angry about Ishbosheth's accusation. Am I a dog's head who belongs to Judah? He asked. All this time I've been loyal to the family of your father Saul, to his brother and to his friends, and haven't betrayed you to David. But now you accuse me of wrongdoing with this woman? Now, I need to set the background context, because if you open up this verse, you have no idea what he's talking about. And Ishbosheth is the youngest son of Saul. Remember, the other sons of Saul were killed in battle. And this son of his was not really prepared to be king. He didn't even think about it, more than likely because he had other sons older than him that would have taken the place. But where they lost their life, he was kind of ill prepared, and he wasn't really much of a leader. He didn't have the people of Israel on his side, really. They didn't trust him as a leader. And so Ishbosheth is kind of being usurped by Abner. Abner, the military leader. You see, all the military men trusted him. And so they were willing to follow him. But you see, he actually takes Ishbosheth outside of the camp and nominates him basically as king over Israel. But yet, on the other hand, Abner did something that was a big-time no-no. Does anyone know what he did? He talks about taking this woman. Well, what Saul was married to a number of women. Well, one of his wives, one of his the women that Saul married, was a woman that Abner took as his own wife after Saul died. And for Ishbosheth, he was angry about it. And he said something to Abner, and this is why Abner says, Abner was very angry about Ishbosheth's accusation. He says, am I a dog's head who belongs to Judah? In other words, he's defending himself, kind of fighting back of what Ishbosheth had accused him of. But understand something, Ishbosheth had every right to be angry. Because what nations would do if people would marry or take a wife of the king, it was disrespectful to the king. And what he was doing is claiming his position as part of that family. And if Ishbosheth then is knocked off as king, guess who would step in as king? And so Abner done something that was a big time no-no. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay.
No. Why? I'm not done praying. You still pray. Come here, I have some tea.
All right, now, it was actually Saul's concubine Rizpah, which was still his property, was still one of his women. And so what happened is when Abner did this, he disgraced Saul's line, his whole family. And again, he was claiming, ultimately, his place in the line of Saul. You see, kingship was passed on. And so we're going to find out here in a little bit that plays into what happens with David in the final outcome of what goes on here. And so we need to understand that the reason that the Ishbosheth was angry was because Abner did something that was very disgraceful to his family. And Abner, in defense, basically says, am I a dog? Haven't I been loyal to you? Why would you think I'd do something to harm your family now? Was kind of his mentality there. But then he says to his brothers and to his friends, and haven't betrayed you to David, but now you accuse me of wrongdoing with this woman. What we're going to find out is he turns around and then says, well, I'm just going to join David's side now, if that's what you're going to do. Now, we learned last week about respecting those in authority, just like David did to Saul. Even though Saul would chase after him and try to kill him, David respected him enough not to disgrace him, right? Well, what in the world was Abner doing? The one that was Saul's right-hand man militarily, he turned around and disgraced the family immediately after. He knew the same thing that everybody in Israel knew, though. Ishbosheth was no king material. He didn't have the power, the authority, and the people following him to be able to lead the people. And maybe that's the reason that he did it. The Bible doesn't really say, but as far as historically speaking, it was a bad choice. The author here of the lesson talks a lot about Ishbosheth and what his name means. It basically means man of disgrace. But his name actually in Hebrew would have been Eshbaal. And Baal we think of later on in history as being a bad thing, right? The god Baal. But actually during this time, that wasn't the thought process, because Baal also means, let's see, he's got it written, Baal also means master or lord. So more than likely, because Jonathan had a son with the heading Baal as well, he was probably meaning master or Lord in that. So we can read into it wrong just because we know the future about what happened in history, but right now, that's not the situation. So he was not a worshiper of Baal or anything. Like sometimes later on in history, you see that was actually the case. But really, in our translation and our understanding, it means man of disgrace. But in reality, it may have meant master or Lord instead of disgrace. So the author spends a lot of time dealing with this. I don't understand why he did, because it doesn't really apply anything, but I just wanted to let you know that. You can look it up if you want more details on that. But Ishbosheth, unlike his father, was not bold and a skillful warrior, so he wasn't even a military person. And so you think about it for a minute. All this group of people that now they went from a warrior king to a king that has no experience, that has no military skill, no military thought process. Anyway, he was basically pampered as a child, like most people, most children of kings, except for the one who was going to take kingship. And people just didn't have a whole lot of respect for him. And so Abner's using that to his benefit here. Even though Abner's supposed to be for him and nominated him as king over Israel, or set him ahead or up as king over Israel, he's ultimately trying to undermine him from underneath. And that's what Ishbosheth recognized. And the people would have recognized that and seen it as, look, he's a pushover because Abner's doing this to him and he's afraid to do anything to him. You see, Ishbosheth was afraid of Abner because he knew all the people trusted him, trusted Abner. And so Ishbosheth's kind of in a hard position here. He's trying to be king, but yet he don't have the authority to be king. And he don't have the following to be king. And so he interpreted this attempt by Abner to claim the throne for himself and create a new dynastic line. And so if we look at the Old Testament, we see that Reuben tried to do this when he slept with Bilhah, his father's concubine, in Genesis 35. Absalom set up a tent on the roof in the place in Jerusalem, and he took his father's concubine into the tent in the sight of all Israel. David's son, he did exactly the same thing. And that was what that was meaning. It wasn't because he fell in love with this woman. It was because it was a political move to disgrace his father and his family. And to say, look, I have the authority to take his place. I have what was his. And so it was a sign of disrespect. And so that's what Abner was doing here. And so I don't know about you, but when people prey on your weakness, like Abner did, what is Ishbosheth going to do? And he knew that. What was he going to do? How do you deal with that as someone in leadership? We're going to find out that there was going to be a blessing for Ishbosheth a little later on, but something happened because of the ignorance of the people that did something to him. So let's move on to verse 9. He says, "May God punish Abner and do so severely if I don't do for David what the Lord swore to him." And this is Abner speaking. He says, "To transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Ishbosheth did not dare respond to Abner because he was afraid of him. And so Abner turns around after the accusation and says, "Am I a dog?" Then he says, "You know what? May God punish me if I don't turn the kingdom back over to David." He's the one that just crowned the man as king, and then he turns around and says, "Well, God's already set him aside, so I'm just going to join his side now." Now, I might stop and ask a question. Abner, like any human being, was seeking his own gain. And when he got called out on it, what did he do? He reacted like most people do. Well, if that's what you're going to do, then I'm going to do this. Right? Now, I'm going to stop for a second and ask you this question. Did God use his arrogance, ignorance, and selfishness to benefit his purpose? That's something we need to stop and ask. Can God use our ignorance? Can God use our bad decisions? Can God use our failures to benefit his purposes? Because we're going to find out here in a little bit, God used Abner not because of his goodness, but because of his selfishness. And I'm not saying that we need to be selfish because God's going to use us. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is God uses us in spite of who we are. Abner's going to pay the price later on for his actions, but he didn't really deserve what he got. And for that reason, Joab later on pays a penalty for that as well. But what I've seen in this text, in this passage, is Ishbosheth was really not prepared. And God set it up that when Saul fell, his sons that were able to lead as king died with him. Even Jonathan. You think David would have had a hard time ousting Jonathan, his best friend? I'd say so. God had planned all this. God knew what was going to take place. You see, God is all-knowing. He plans everything out. And the ones that were able to lead as king in Saul's line were gone. Ishbosheth didn't have the authority. And then Abner, who was wanting it, ended up giving it over out of defense of himself. Isn't it funny how God can use our crazy actions, our ignorance, our stupidity in spite of us and still get his purposes accomplished? Because that's what we're going to see happens. And it says here, Ishbosheth didn't dare respond to Abner because he was afraid of him. And so Ishbosheth never incited his authority as king against Abner because he knew that it wasn't going to do any good. And he probably was going to lose his life if he did, because Abner had all the military men behind him. And so this is what Abner says. He says, all right, I'm just going to get everyone to follow me right over onto David's side. Isn't that exactly what God wanted to begin with? Isn't that how God planned it, that David was going to be king over all Israel? Well, it says in verse 12, Abner sent messengers as his representatives to say to David, whose land is it? Make your covenant with me, and you can be certain I am on your side to turn all Israel over to you. But there it is. Abner's willing to make a covenant with David. You know what part of that covenant probably is? You'll save my life, first of all. And it's probably you'll give me a position in the military as leader, because these people already want to follow me. And David replied, good, I will make a covenant with you. However, there's one thing I require of you. You will not see my face unless you first bring Saul's daughter Michal, however you want to say that, when you come to see me. Now, there's something that you may not know whenever you read that until you go back a little bit. Remember before Saul started chasing after David and wanting to kill him? Remember, Saul gave his daughter Michal to David as his wife. Remember? Okay, and then when he found out David was set apart to be king over Israel, what did he do? He took her away and gave her to somebody else. Why did he do that? Was that just because he was mad at David? There was political gain in it for him. If David's in Saul's line, it's natural for David then to take the throne right after Saul. But because he married into the family, and so then he's a member of the family of Saul. Well, so he gave Michal, whatever you want to say, to somebody else, so that David didn't have the option to step up into that position. You see, it's very political. It's not by accident. And why did David ask for her back? They never got divorced. She was just taken away. Why did he ask for her back? Did he love her so much that he couldn't live without her? You're going to find out later on that Michal is the one that when David danced in front of her, when they brought the Ark of the Covenant back, danced, that the Bible says he was stripped down. When he danced and praised God for the Ark of the Covenant being back, that she criticized him. She was not happy about it. Most commentators think that she didn't have much of a happy life because the Bible says she never had any children. And so she wasn't there because David loved her more than likely. She was there out of political gain. David already had many wives. He already had a number of wives by this point. And that's no model for a Christian. That's no model for God. God never designed it that way, but it was political as kings a lot of times. And so he asked for this one specific thing because it would secure his throne before the people of Israel who was against him. Now he's back in the family line of Saul, and it's an easier transition for him to step in as king. You see all the politics that's going on behind the scenes. A lot of times we look today and we think, well, it's all politics. Well, there's a lot that went on back then too. We just didn't understand it. And so David asked for this one specific thing. He says, all right, Abner, I'll make a covenant with you and protect you if you'll do this one thing. But that's my stipulation. And then let's see what happened. In verse 14 it says, then David sent messengers to say to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, give me back my wife, Michal. I was engaged to her for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. So Ishbosheth sent someone to take her away from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband followed her, weeping all the way to Bahurim. Abner said to him, go back. So he went back. Now I want you to ask yourself a question. She'd been living with this man for a good while now. And it says here that her husband followed weeping. So he obviously had strong feelings for her. He loved her. And it was hard for him to let go. And Ishbosheth said, go back home. In other words, you don't have a choice. Go back. She's gone now. Now, if he had that kind of feelings for her, do you think she maybe had those kind of feelings for him? And then when she was taken away, she resented David for it. Maybe that's why she acted like she did later on and got mad at him for dancing before the Lord. You see the mess that was going on here? You see, the kings weren't concerned about the happiness of people. They were concerned about their throne. But whose fault is it that she's unhappy? And he's unhappy? Her husband, her one that she was stripped away from. It was her own dad's fault. Right? Life might have been completely different for her if she'd have stayed David's king, because the Bible indicates at first she had strong feelings for David. But at this point, she's been away from him for years, and now, look, there's a relationship she's built with somebody else, and now she's stripped away from that. And I'm sure she was not a happy camper. And I'm sure that played out in all that went on, but you can see how sin affects so many different people other than just us. And Saul's actions affected his whole family. Ultimately, his sons were killed, and then his throne was stripped away because of his sin. But what we see here is, you notice David didn't send the message to Abner and say, all right, go get her and bring her to me. Who did he send it to? The king. You know how? Look at how the king reacted. Did he say, "Nuh-uh, I'm going to defend my throne"? What did he say?
You never.
You never. You think he was maybe trying to protect his own life? I think so. He knew where he was at, didn't he? He knew that Abner was against him, and he knew he had nothing to do except protect his own life. And so he went and said, "She's yours. Take her." And you know what? He knew when he did that, he was succeeding the throne to David. There was no question about it. He was giving the throne over to David. The people knew it, he knew it, and that was the end of it. And so, God, in His foreknowledge, in His understanding, in His power, shifted the whole nation of Israel from killing each other, because there was a civil war going on in the midst of them, from killing each other to siding with one another, to bringing the nation together. You see, the sin is what was separating them to begin with. If Saul would have said, "You know what, that's fine, once I die, David's king," if he'd have just done that up front instead of tried to keep everything he could keep a hold of, things would have went smoothly, but they didn't. And Saul's sin affected the whole nation and caused death and caused conflict. But God, in the midst of all that, brought it all together somehow. Isn't it amazing how God can do what needs to be done in spite of who we are? God chooses people to use, and sometimes they don't even know they're being used by Him. Hopefully, as Christians, we understand that God does use us. And hopefully uses us in our obedience and not our disobedience. But He can use us in both because He's God. And so, let's look at the last section. It's called a consolidated kingdom. And this is where God had brought everything together. It says, Abner conferred with the elders of Israel. In the past, you wanted David to be king over you. Now, Abner's given a talk to the people. Now, take action, because the Lord has spoken concerning David. Through my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the power of the Philistines and the power of all Israel's enemies. Abner also informed the Benjamites and went to Hebron to inform David about all that was agreed on by Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. When Abner and 20 men came to David at Hebron, David held a banquet for him and his men. Abner said to David, "Let me now go, and I will gather all Israel to my lord the king. They will make a covenant with you, and you will reign over all you desire." So David dismissed Abner, and he went in peace. You see, David wasn't a cutthroat king. He was just trying to do what God commanded to be done. And he just wanted to fulfill the call that God had placed on him. He wasn't out to take out all the people in the kingdom that didn't side with him, because most kings would have. And what we find here is that God brought it all together, and there was a covenant made, and David then was presented as king by Abner, who the people trusted. And it says he specifically went to Benjamin. Why is that so important? You notice that the author could have put down any of the many groups where people lived in Israel. He could have put down all the different names, but he put specifically Benjamin. Why did he do that? Where was Saul from? The tribe of Benjamin. If he can gain Saul's own tribe of people, then all the rest of the people are going to follow too. Who else was from Benjamin? Abner was too. So, God in His Word reminds us and shows us that He is able to even bring those who would most be against Him together and bridge the gap and bring peace. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. In the church today, when there's conflict, does God want the gap to be bridged and to bring us all together to fulfill His purpose? Or does He want us to continue to pit sides against one another? And I'm going to say it this way, God can even use our ignorance and stupidity to make it happen, can't He? Yeah. And you know what else God can do? He can take you out. He'll just send you to another church and let them have all the problems. Now, I'm not trying to be mean, but the reality is God is concerned about peace among His people. Because it's hard to accomplish a goal whenever there's constant conflict amongst the people. You cannot accomplish things when you have a nation divided against itself. Isn't that what the Bible says? A nation divided against itself will never stand. A people divided against itself will never stand. Israel was so concerned about fighting one another, the enemies could have came in and taken them. But in God's grace, He didn't allow that to happen.
Well, they were coming in and taking them one at a time.
And that's what I'm saying. By God's grace, He didn't allow them to be destroyed at this time. And so, God allowed the unity to take place because David was set apart to be king. God's going to fulfill His promise. You see, when God makes a promise, we can bank on it. There's no question about it. So, we don't know how it's going to happen sometimes, but God gets it done because He's God and He's able to. And so, what we find out a little later is, there was a lot of animosity between Abner and Joab, the commanders of the armies. You know why? Because Abner killed Joab's brother in battle. Guess what Joab did to Abner? He had him executed later on. And you know what David did? He held the public service for him and praised Abner for who he was and what he'd done for Saul. And basically he said, I had nothing to do with this. Because what would that have done just after they come together? It would have looked like David had it done to knock him off because he was an enemy. And David said, I didn't have anything to do with this. Actually, he put a curse on Joab for doing it. And something else happened. And you don't read about it here. You read about it a little later on. There was two men, Bana and Rechab. They sought advancement. So they went and took Ishbosheth and killed him and brought his head to the king. They said, okay, here, we've done this for you, David. What did David do? He had him executed. Because he said, look, I didn't have nothing to do with this one either. His goal there was to bring peace. He was going to allow, more than likely, Abner to keep a position as a military leader, and more than likely, just protect Ishbosheth. Let him live a peaceful life and go on, because he didn't do anything to try to hurt David. He just gave it over and said, here you go. It's yours. David was going to reward him more than likely, but these men acted in and of themselves trying to gain position, because naturally, if it was Saul, he would have given them benefits for doing what they did. But David wasn't the same kind of king. He wasn't there about himself. He was there to honor God, and that's the difference. You see, God can bring things together for a leader who's willing to serve Him. But if they're going to serve themselves, He'll put someone else in their place. You see, Abner tried, but he didn't even get the opportunity. And ultimately, he died later on for it. As an act of aggression against him that wasn't really fair. Because if you read the story about Joab's brother, he chased after him, and Abner turned and said, Quit chasing me before I kill you. And he tried to let him go back, but he wouldn't. And Joab's brother continued to pursue him, so he finally turned around and killed him. And so really, Joab had no right, because the man gave his own death sentence by chasing after Abner. You see the mess that went on? Selfishness and greed causes so many problems, but obedience to the Lord has nothing but benefits. Isn't it funny how God, in His grace and His mercy, in spite of who we are, continues to work in and through us? It's amazing to me, because when I look at the situations that went on, that same stuff goes on today, just in our culture, doesn't it? We vie for power. We try to be at the front for everyone to see us. In business, we try to be the one that makes the most money. And David didn't seek to be king because of what he wanted. He sought to be king because God had promised him that was his call, and that was what was to be done for him. David in all was a good king. He made a lot of mistakes, done a lot of things that God wouldn't be pleased with, but God knew he was the best choice, and therefore He rose him up, and He made it happen. So it's hard for me sometimes to teach these lessons whenever a lot of things don't. It's hard to apply some of these things to us. But what I seen the big picture in this lesson today is this: God can use our failures and still get His goals accomplished. And if there's division among God's people, we need to deal with it and bring it together. But the only way we're going to do it is allow God to do it. Seek Him. Because we don't have the power to forgive. The Spirit that lives within us has the power to forgive and move on. And so, let's keep that in mind as we go forward this week. That God will accomplish His goal. He can use us or He'll use somebody else. But His desire is we find unity with one another. And that His purposes will move forward. You see, that's the reason David needed to be king, so God could accomplish in Israel what needed to be accomplished. The reason we need to come together and serve the Lord in His mission is so that God's purposes will be accomplished in our time, in our church, in our community, in our nation, and in our world. That's what God wants, and so are we going to be obedient to it?